Javakir Sindarov is running away with this tournament. Heading into round 8, the young Uzbekian prodigy sits on 6.5 points, a full 2 points clear of Fabiano Caruana and Anish Giri, who share second at 4.5. For the chasers, every game is now a must-win situation. Hikaru Nakamura, sitting on 3.5, desperately needs points to stay relevant, and today he gets the most dangerous opponent in the field. The game everyone wanted to see. Hikaru Nakamura is one of the most tactically gifted players in the world, famous for his relentless pressure and in-game precision. Fabiano Caruana is arguably the deepest opening theorist alive, a player who prepares concrete lines to an extraordinary depth. Nakamura needs a win to stay in the tournament race, while Caruana needs a result to keep pace with Sindarov at the top. The English opening is a classical choice, steering the game away from heavily memorized territory while maintaining rich strategic complexity. The symmetrical variation leads to positions where both sides mirror each other's pawn structure before gradually diverging. Players like Anatoly Karpov and Magnus Carlsen have used the English extensively to squeeze opponents positionally. The anti-Benoni approach signals White's desire to challenge the center immediately. Nakamura opens with the English, a sign that he is ready for a long, strategic battle rather than a sharp theoretical fight. The pawn on c4 stakes a claim on the d5 square and delays the central tension. Caruana responds symmetrically, meeting the flank advance with his own queenside pawn. This is the most principled reply, immediately, establishing a mirror structure and fighting for central influence from the very first move. White develops the knight to its most natural square, controlling e5 and d4 while maintaining maximum flexibility. No commitments just yet. Black brings out the queen's knight, putting pressure on the d4 square and preparing to contest the center, a natural and harmonious developing move. Nakamura strikes in the center immediately, transforming the game into more open territory. This is the anti-Benoni approach, challenging Black to declare his intentions before development is complete. Caruana accepts the central trade, removing the tension and entering the symmetrical main line. Taking with the pawn is the most solid option, liquidating White's d-pawn. White recaptures with the knight, centralizing it powerfully, on d4. The knight sits beautifully here, controlling key squares while eyeing both the queenside and kingside. Black develops the king's knight toward the center, a standard and necessary move. The knight eyes d5 and e4, establishing a firm presence in the heart of the board. White reinforces the center with the queen's knight, completing a solid development setup. Both knights are now actively placed, and White has a slight space advantage. Caruana solidifies the center with this classical pawn move, preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop and castle kingside. The structure begins to resemble a Nimzo or Queen's Gambit declined type of position. Nakamura deploys the bishop to EFF4, an active square outside the pawn chain. This bishop development before committing the e-pawn is a key idea in these structures, preventing Black from easily playing d5. Black pushes for central space, challenging White's strong knight on d4. This thematic break is typical for Black in these symmetrical structures, fighting for the initiative in the center. White captures immediately, opening the c-file and forcing Black to make a structural decision. Exchanging here keeps the position dynamic and avoids a locked center. Black recaptures with the knight, centralizing it on a dominant outpost. The knight on d5 is very strong here, and Black has already equalized the central tension. White trades off Black's supporting knight, removing the defender of d5. This exchange is a key strategic decision, forcing Black to choose how to recapture and alter the pawn structure. Caruana recaptures toward the center, maintaining pawn presence on c6. While this creates doubled c-pawns, the open b-file and active pieces provide compensation for the structural concession. White retreats the bishop to d2, a prophylactic move that connects the rooks and prepares to challenge the strong knight on d5. The bishop eyes the a5 square as well. Black pins the c3 knight, adding pressure and developing aggressively. This bishop move is a typical idea, threatening to double White's c-pawns and creating immediate tension. Nakamura responds with a queen move that attacks the pinning bishop directly. The queen on a4 also eyes the c6 pawn, creating dual threats and forcing Black to respond accurately. Caruana defends the bishop by pushing the a-pawn, shutting down the queen's attack. This advance also stakes space on the queen side, though it slightly weakens the b5 square. White seizes central space with e4, directly challenging the knight on d5. This powerful advance gives White more room and puts the Black pieces under immediate pressure. Black eliminates the c3 knight, disrupting white's pawn structure. Trading here is logical, as the d5 square would have been under attack, and the knight needed to move anyway. White recaptures with the b-pawn, giving himself the doubled c-pawns, but opening the b-file for the rook. The structure is now somewhat symmetrically imbalanced on both sides. The bishop retreats to e7, a safe and solid square. Black prepares to castle and consolidate, ceding the bishop pair but aiming for a solid defensive setup. White develops the bishop to e2, preparing to castle kingside. The bishop connects the rooks and covers key central squares, completing a clean development sequence. Caruana castles kingside, tucking the king to safety. With the center relatively closed, this is the right time to connect the rooks and complete development. Nakamura repositions the bishop to eff4, an active post that targets the weak c7 square and eyes the long diagonal. White is building pressure on the queen side before committing to any major plan. Black activates the light-squared bishop to a6, targeting the e2 bishop and the weakened squares around it. This bishop trade is Black's way of simplifying and seeking counterplay. White captures on a6, accepting the trade. The rook on a8 will now be displaced, giving White a temporary initiative advantage. Black recaptures with the rook, activating it along the a-file. The rook is somewhat awkwardly placed on a6 for now, but it could prove useful as the game opens up. White places the rook on the d-file, centralizing it and adding pressure down the semi-open file. This is a strong prophylactic move, preparing to contest the d-file. Black centralizes the queen to b6, where it eyes both the b2 pawn and puts pressure on the queen side. The queen is well placed here, coordinating with the rook on a6. Nakamura finally castles, getting the king safe before pushing for a concrete plan. With the rooks connected, White is now ready to begin active operations. The queen slides to b5, maintaining its active position and keeping an eye on the queenside pawns. Black continues to apply pressure while looking for the right moment to activate the rook. White retreats the queen to c2, a solid multi-purpose square. The queen defends the pawn structure and keeps eyes on both the e4 advance and potential h7 ideas. Caruana activates the bishop aggressively to c5, putting it on a powerful diagonal. The bishop eyes the eff2 pawn and also threatens to trade favorably or cause discomfort to White's king. Nakamura advances c4, kicking the queen away and claiming more central space. This move also prepares to push the c-pawn further, challenging Black's position on the queenside. The queen retreats to b7, a somewhat passive square but one that keeps the queenside connected. Black is trying to maintain coordination while regrouping. White plants the bishop on the powerful e5 outpost, where it dominates the board. The bishop on e5 is extremely active, threatening to create threats against the Black king while restricting Black's pieces. Black moves the queen to e7, eyeing the e5 bishop and regrouping. This defensive maneuver keeps the queen more centralized while preparing to challenge White's dominant piece. White repositions the queen to d3, a wonderful central square. From here the queen covers the d-file, supports potential kingside advances, and maintains pressure across the board. Caruana challenges the bishop on e5 with eff6, forcing a decision. This pawn push is double-edged, gaining space but slightly weakening the king's defensive cover. Nakamura retreats the bishop all the way to d6, an inspired maneuver. From d6, the bishop is extremely powerful, forking the rooks on eff8 and a6, while also creating threats against the Black king. Black takes the bishop, relieving the immediate pressure. Allowing that bishop to remain on d6 would have been positionally suffocating, so this trade is practically forced. White recaptures with the queen, landing on a dominant central square. The queen on d6 is extremely powerful, putting pressure on both the rooks and restricting Black's coordination significantly. Caruana trades queens, trying to simplify into a less dangerous endgame. With material equal and the queens gone, Black hopes the rooks can hold the position together. Nakamura recaptures with the rook, dominating the d-file. The rook on d6 is powerful and invasive, and suddenly Black's position starts to look quite uncomfortable. Black moves the rook to b8, activating it along the b-file and seeking counterplay. The rook eyes the second rank and hopes to generate threats against White's pawns. Nakamura captures the e6 pawn, winning material. The rook on e6 is now a monster, controlling the 6th rank while White has gained a free pawn. Black activates the rook to b2, immediately creating counterplay against White's queenside pawns. This active rook placement is Black's best practical try, threatening to gobble up the a2 pawn. White invades on the 7th rank with the rook, creating devastating threats against the pawns on g7 and h7. The rook on e7 is dominant and cuts the black king off from the center. The other rook comes to b6, doubling on the b-file and creating pressure. Black is trying to generate enough counterplay to compensate for the exposed king and lost pawn. White repositions the rook to a7, keeping maximum pressure on black's pawns. The a7 rook eyes the a5 pawn and ties black's rooks to defensive duties. Caruana captures the a2 pawn, winning a pawn back. With 2 active rooks on the 2nd and 6th ranks, black has some compensation, but white's rook on a7 is still very strong. Nakamura plays a prophylactic pawn move, securing the back rank and preventing any back rank mating threats. This calm move also prepares to advance the kingside pawns. Caruana pushes h5, a move that turns out to be a critical mistake. The engine evaluation swings significantly here. Black was trying to create kingside counterplay, but this advance weakens the g5 square and will cost black dearly in the endgame, where white's extra pawn and active rooks prove decisive. White brings the EFF1 rook into the game, adding a 3rd attacker on the d-file and preparing to double rooks. Nakamura's pieces are now perfectly coordinated. Black doubles rooks on the 2nd rank, a last-ditch attempt to generate back-rank threats. However, this allows white to deliver a devastating check, and the evaluation swings dramatically toward white as the black king becomes fatally exposed. Check on d8, forcing the king to move. This is the beginning of a relentless king hunt, as Nakamura's rooks coordinate perfectly to drive the black king into the open. The king flees to h7, the only square available, but stepping to h7 turns out to be another inaccuracy as the evaluation climbs further. The king is now exposed on the h-file and vulnerable to the incoming rooks. Both white rooks are now on the 7th rank, an absolutely devastating formation. White's rooks completely dominate the board, threatening mate and winning material simultaneously. Caruana captures the EFF2 pawn in desperation, trying to generate some counterplay, but the evaluation keeps climbing as white's attack is simply too powerful to stop. The rook captures on g7 with check, stripping away black's last kingside pawn and exposing the king further. The king hunt is now in full swing. The king retreats to h8, forced to run from the rooks. This continues the pattern of the evaluation climbing steadily as each escape square is cut off one by one. Check on h7, driving the king back into the open. Nakamura's technique is clinical and precise, using the rooks in perfect coordination. The king moves to g8, the only available square. Every king move in this sequence allows white to strengthen the winning advantage further. Both rooks on the 7th rank deliver relentless checks, forcing the king to the edge. The black king has nowhere to hide. The king staggers to EFF8, trying to escape the mating net, but the advantage continues to grow as the king ventures further from safety. Check on EFF7, keeping the king on the run. White's rooks control the entire 7th rank, giving the black king no rest. The king returns to g8, going in circles under the relentless rook pressure. The evaluation stands decisively in white's favor throughout this sequence. Another check from the h-rook, continuing the coordinated assault. Nakamura is methodically maneuvering both rooks to maximize pressure. The king has no choice but to return to h8, and with each move, the position grows more desperate for Caruana. The material deficit and exposed king combine to make defense impossible. White repositions a rook to g6, stepping back from the check sequence to consolidate and prepare a more strategic approach. The advantage is overwhelming, and white can afford to improve rook placement. Caruana tries to activate the rook to EFF4, seeking to create counter-threats, but the evaluation climbs higher still, as white's coordination is simply too strong. White captures the EFF6 pawn, winning another pawn and increasing the material advantage. The rooks now dominate the entire board. Black captures back, forced to trade a rook to avoid losing more material. The evaluation remains decisively in white's favor even after this simplification. White recaptures with the rook, maintaining the dominant rook on the 6th rank. With extra pawns and an active rook, Nakamura now heads into a winning king and pawn in game. The king activates toward the center, a necessary step as black tries to use the king in the endgame, but the evaluation remains firmly decisive for white. Nakamura captures the c6 pawn, gobbling up another free pawn. White now has a substantial material advantage in addition to the active rook. Caruana centralizes the rook to c2, the most active square available. Black tries to create some rook activity and pose problems for white's pawns. White repositions the rook to c5, a powerful central square that simultaneously defends the c4 pawn and targets the a5 pawn. Nakamura's technique is precise and efficient. The black king advances to g6, trying to activate and support the a-pawn push, but white is already winning comfortably with the extra pawns. White captures the a5 pawn, winning yet another pawn and creating a passed pawn on the e-file. The material advantage is now overwhelming. Black captures the c4 pawn in return, finally winning something back, but the evaluation still favors white heavily, with two passed pawns and an active rook. The rook swings to e5, supporting the powerful e4 pawn and preparing to advance it. Nakamura centralizes every piece before pushing the decisive pawn. Caruana pushes h4, attempting to create a passed pawn on the kingside. This is a last desperate hope, trying to give white something to worry about. White activates the king, bringing it closer to the center of the action. In rook-in games, king activity is crucial, and Nakamura begins the king march toward the decisive pawns. Black checks on c2, hoping to disrupt white's king march, but these checks only delay the inevitable rather than providing real defensive chances. The king steps to eff3, evading the check and continuing the march. White is completely unfazed by the checks. Another check on c3, continuing the harassment, but the king simply steps around these checks, and the winning advantage is not diminished. The king marches to g4, heading toward the h4 pawn and simultaneously supporting the e4 advance. Nakamura's king is fearless in this endgame. Check on g3, but this simply walks the king closer to the h4 pawn rather than creating real threats. The evaluation keeps climbing for white. White captures the h4 pawn, eliminating the last black passed pawn. Now white's connected passed pawns on e4 and h3 become the decisive factor. Caruana captures the g2 pawn, winning some material, but it is simply not enough to save the position with white's advanced pawns and active rook. The rook swings to eff5, an excellent active square. From eff5, the rook cuts the black king off while supporting the advance of the e and h pawns. Black places the rook on g1, trying to create backrank pressure and slow down white's passed pawns. The defensive task remains extremely difficult. Nakamura repositions the rook to eff4, a flexible square from which it supports the e4 pawn and prevents the black king from approaching. The technique is methodical. Black moves the rook to a1, looking to check the white king from behind and create nuisance, but white's king is well protected by its own pawns and rook. The white king steps to g3, away from the check threat. Nakamura is carefully coordinating king and rook to advance the pawns safely. Another check from behind, trying to disturb the white king, but these checks are running out of steam as the king finds safe squares. The king retreats slightly to eff3, maintaining a strong position while keeping the black rook at bay. White is in no rush. Check on eff1, forcing another king move. Caruana is throwing everything at the white king, but the checks are not yielding any real defensive improvements. The king steps to e3, centralizing and defending the e4 pawn directly. The king is safe here and well placed to support the pawn advances. Black checks on e1, one more attempt to disrupt white's coordination. The evaluation remains firmly decisive for Nakamura at this point. The king advances boldly to d4, a central and powerful square. From here, the king supports both the e4 pawn and the potential c-pawn advance. Caruana shifts the rook back to a1, looking for a different defensive angle. The position remains technically lost, with white's advanced pawns and dominant king. Nakamura repositions the rook to eff5 again, eyeing the h5 square and preparing to push the h-pawn. The plan is simple and effective: advance and promote. Black moves to h1, attacking the h3 pawn from behind. This is a last attempt to create some counter-threats, but the evaluation remains firmly in white's favor. White defends the h3 pawn with the rook on eff3, a practical decision. The rook on EFF3 also keeps the black king at a distance. Caruana shifts the rook back to a1, continuing the holding attempts, but white's advantage is too large to be contained at this point. Nakamura advances the h-pawn, creating a second passed pawn that will be decisive. With both the e4 and h4 pawns marching forward, black has no way to stop both. Black checks on a4, trying to deflect the white king, but white can simply step around the check and continue advancing the pawns. The king advances to e5, stepping into the center and supporting the e-pawn directly. From e5, the king is extremely active, and the evaluation confirms white is completely winning. Another check, forcing the king to move again. Caruana is trying to use perpetual check as a last resort, but white has enough room to escape. The king steps to EFF4, evading the check and maintaining a powerful central position. White is now ready to push both passed pawns to the finish line. Black shifts the rook to h5, attacking the h4 pawn. This is the last defensive try, but white can simply advance the e-pawn and use the rook to support it. The king steps to g4, defending the h4 pawn and keeping maximum central control. Nakamura's technique is patient and precise. Caruana shifts the rook to e5, attacking the e4 pawn directly, but with the white king firmly on g4 and the rook on EFF3, white's position holds comfortably. The rook swings to EFF4, defending the e4 pawn and keeping the black rook under surveillance. White's rook and king work in perfect harmony. The black king moves to h6, trying to approach the h4 pawn and create a threat, but the evaluation remains firmly in white's favor. White steps the king back to EFF3, a subtle waiting move that keeps full control of the position. Nakamura is maneuvering precisely to avoid any defensive tricks. The black king retreats to g6, probing for a better angle of attack. The evaluation remains solidly in white's favor as the game continues. White continues the king dance, moving to e3 and maintaining maximum flexibility. The king can support the e4 pawn or approach the center as needed. Black repositions the rook to a5, trying to attack the h5 pawn from the side, but white has a strong response that ends the game decisively. White checks on g4, driving the king away from its active post. The check is tactical and helps white advance the decisive pawns. The king retreats to EFF6, forced to move by the check. Black continues to look for defensive chances, but the position is overwhelming. The rook swings to g5, a powerful square that attacks the a5 rook and prepares to push the h-pawn. White's pieces are perfectly coordinated for the final push. Caruana retreats the rook to a1, waiting and watching. Black has run out of active options and can only watch as white's pawns advance. White plays another check on EFF5, and the evaluation shows a slight dip, but white remains completely winning. The check forces the king to move again. The king steps to g6, and now white has a spectacular continuation that seals the game. The evaluation spikes dramatically as Nakamura finds the decisive pawn advance. Nakamura advances h5 with check, a stunning pawn push that forces the king to move while the pawn marches forward. The h-pawn is now unstoppable. The king is forced to h6, stepping into the corner. The evaluation is now approaching 5 pawns in white's favor as the pawn advances become decisive. White advances the e-pawn as well, creating an unstoppable duo of passed pawns. With 2 pawns charging up the board and a rook supporting them, Caruana resigned shortly after. A masterclass in in-game technique from Nakamura. The game was decided by Nakamura's superb in-game technique. After building pressure through the middle game, the h5 advance on move 29 was the turning point that gave white a decisive advantage. From there, Nakamura's rooks dominated the board entirely. His connected passed pawns proved unstoppable, and Caruana had no defense to the incoming e5 and h5 advance at the end. Massive win for Nakamura, who climbs back into the race with a brilliant in-game performance. Sindarov's lead at the top remains, but the chasing pack is tightening. With several rounds still to play, anything can happen. Let us know in the comments who you think will challenge Sindarov, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more candidates coverage.